This is a story about family, greed, and a very peculiar piece of land. A piece of land that, for years, we simply called the backyard plot. It was maybe a quarter of an acre, situated right at the rear edge of the expansive property my grandparents, bless their souls, had owned for nearly 60 years. When they passed, the estate, a sprawling, gorgeous piece of American dream, was meticulously split between my father, his sister, and their cousin, Marcus. Yes, that cousin, Marcus, the self-made, annoyingly successful real estate mogul. My parents inherited the original, modest family home, which sat on the front half of the lot. Marcus, however, got the lion's share, the entire back 2 acres. He built a fortress back there, a 3-story, custom-designed mansion that looked less like a home and more like a minimalist art museum designed by a billionaire. It was colossal, cold, and entirely inaccessible, or so we thought. The family house my parents received was charming, but old. The roof needed replacing, the plumbing was temperamental, and the air conditioning unit sounded like a dying robot. But it was the family home, filled with memories, and my parents loved it. The backyard plot, the subject of this entire ordeal, was a tiny rectangular strip of grass and dirt that ran between my parents' property line and the fence marking the start of Marcus's new dominion. It was barely wide enough for a sedan, maybe 10 feet across, and it stretched about 50 feet long. Functionally, for us, it was where Dad kept his compost bins and where Mom sometimes planted her less successful tomato experiments. It was a space so insignificant that, when the property lines were formally redrawn during the probate process, the backyard plot wasn't explicitly defined or incorporated into either of the main properties. It was, essentially, a small, orphaned wedge of earth, a forgotten corner. Marcus, in the early days of his construction, barely acknowledged us. He was too busy overseeing Italian marble imports and arguing with architects about infinity pool placement. He treated my parents' presence as a mild inconvenience. The dust from his construction was a constant headache, the noise relentless. But my father, ever the patient man, just sighed and said, "It's progress, son. Besides, he's family." I had my doubts about that last part. Marcus always carried himself with an air of superior detachment, even at family gatherings where he'd spend more time checking stock prices than talking to his actual relatives. Once the mansion, which I internally nicknamed the Marble Mausoleum, was complete, Marcus moved in and life changed. The noise stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. He rarely came out, and when he did, he used a back gate that opened onto a quiet adjacent street, or so we assumed. The backyard plot, our little strip of family history and tomato failures, remained untouched. Then, about 6 months ago, the first sign of trouble arrived. It was a crisp, official-looking letter delivered by a very uncomfortable-looking courier. The letter was from Marcus's legal team, a fancy firm with a name that sounded like a group of medieval warlords. The core of the letter was a cold, clinical demand: cease and desist all activities on the land currently described as Parcel 42B, otherwise known as the backyard plot. It claimed Marcus had discovered a legal ambiguity during a recent boundary review, and that this plot, in fact, fell under his legal ownership. My father was distraught, not because the land was valuable, it clearly wasn't, but because it felt like a deliberate act of aggression. "Why, Sarah?" he asked me, shaking the paper. "Why does he want my compost bins? He's got 3 acres and a mansion." "It's not about the land, Dad," I replied, feeling a familiar knot of anger tighten in my stomach. "It's about the power. It's about him showing you he can." I immediately contacted a solicitor friend, Emily, who specialized in property disputes. She reviewed the original probate documents, the surveyor's maps, and Marcus's lawyer's letter. Her conclusion was frustratingly vague. She confirmed the backyard plot was indeed left in a legal limbo, technically unattached to either main property. It was like a forgotten appendix of the estate. But here's the kicker. Because it abutted Marcus's much larger property, and he had the resources to file a quitclaim deed and bully us in court, he had a very good chance of winning it. The battle wasn't worth the legal fees, Emily advised. We were talking about sinking $20,000 into legal fees just to save an unused patch of ground. My parents were ready to concede. "It's just dirt, sweetie," my mother said wearily. "Let him have his dirt." But the demand didn't stop at just the land. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was far more menacing. Marcus wasn't just claiming the land. He was threatening to erect a solid 8-foot-high concrete wall along the entire new boundary line, a line that would run right up against the existing chain-link fence separating the two main properties. This wall, ostensibly built to ensure privacy and property value, would completely overshadow my parents' garden, block the afternoon sunlight they cherished, and effectively turn their backyard into a perpetually shadowed, claustrophobic alleyway. The eviction notice for the backyard plot was just the pretext for this act of spiteful architectural warfare. My parents were devastated. This wasn't just dirt anymore. It was their quality of life. My father, who rarely raised his voice, was furious. "He's trying to push us out. He wants the whole original lot." That's when I knew I couldn't stand by. I told my parents to hold off on signing anything, to ignore the threats of the wall for now, and to let me handle it. I felt this surge of adrenaline, not just from the anger Marcus had provoked, but from a growing suspicion. Why? Why this level of malice over a tiny strip of land? Why build a mansion with apparent multiple entrances only to suddenly care about a 10-foot wide space? It didn't make business sense. It didn't make any sense for a man obsessed with efficiency and grand design to waste resources on petty spite unless the backyard plot wasn't insignificant at all. Unless it was the linchpin to his entire lavish existence. I decided right then I would find the flaw in Marcus's meticulously crafted high society facade. I started digging, not in the dirt, but into the local city planning archives, the construction permits, and the surveyor's original blueprints for the marble mausoleum. Something had to give. I was about to find out exactly what the backyard plot was hiding. Marcus's initial legal attack, the claim on the backyard plot, had successfully distracted my parents and most likely, most people who knew about the squabble. But for me, the excessive force he was using was the most glaring red flag. A wealthy, successful man doesn't waste time and money battling over a quarter acre of marginal land unless that land serves a purpose far greater than a glorified barrier against compost bins. My gut screamed that this was a classic legal smokescreen, drawing attention to a minor claim while hiding a massive structural vulnerability. My deep dive started, not with expensive lawyers, but with the cheapest, most accessible tools: public records. The local government website for zoning and building permits became my new homepage. Navigating the municipal archives was an exercise in bureaucratic torture. Everything was filed under obscure parcel numbers and coded designations. But I had one advantage. My father, an old-school engineer, had kept every scrap of paper related to the original estate division and Marcus's construction permits. I started cross-referencing everything. The original subdivision map showed the main house lot, Marcus's back acreage, and the thin, undefined wedge, the backyard plot, labeled simply as an access easement area in some older documents, and completely unlabeled in newer ones. It was a phantom piece of land. I focused specifically on Marcus's construction permits. For a structure as large and complex as the marble mausoleum, the required documentation was immense. Structural integrity reports, environmental impact assessments, and, crucially, mandated access plans for construction and emergency services. I spent 3 consecutive nights fueled by stale coffee and sheer spite. Around 3 a.m. on the 3rd night, I found what I was looking for. It wasn't a single document, but a combination of 3: the final construction site plan, the zoning variance application, and the emergency access certification. The final construction site plan was the first clue. It detailed the layout of the entire property, including the massive front gates and the discrete side gate that opened onto the adjacent, quieter street. I zoomed in on the side gate. It was small, designed for pedestrians or maybe a maintenance vehicle, and marked with the designation, Secondary Utility Access Only. No regular vehicular traffic permitted. This was odd. Why build a mansion with a front entrance only to discourage vehicular use? It was a massive house that would undoubtedly host parties, receive furniture, and require constant service. Where did the main traffic go? The zoning variance application provided the answer to the front gate mystery. Marcus had applied for a variance to build the front of his mansion much closer to the shared property line than normally allowed, arguing for a unique architectural vision. The city approved it, but only with a strict caveat regarding setback requirements for the driveway. Because of the mansion's position, if he used the typical route from the main street, his driveway would have to be an impossibly tight, nearly $100,000 curved nightmare, requiring him to take down several protected heritage trees on his own property. He was too cheap and too worried about his pristine landscaping to do that. The documents noted his solution: an agreement to use a temporary construction access route as the permanent main residential route. And finally, the emergency access certification. This document, required by the fire department, showed that the marble mausoleum had only one officially designated and approved route for regular, full-sized fire trucks, ambulances, and large service vehicles. I traced the line on the map with a trembling finger. The line started from the main road, ran straight back through the backyard plot, and terminated at a grand, imposing gate, a gate I had never seen used, set into the side wall of his mansion, facing my parents' backyard. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. The backyard plot wasn't just a patch of dirt. It wasn't just a shortcut. It was the only viable, city-approved, wide enough, straight-shot access point for any large vehicle to reach Marcus's mansion. His sprawling 3-acre luxury estate, his architectural triumph, his status symbol. It was essentially landlocked for any practical purpose. The front driveway was too tight for large cars or emergency vehicles, and the side utility gate was too narrow. His main functional driveway, the only way he could get his delivery trucks, his landscaper's large equipment, and crucially, emergency services to his home, was the backyard plot. He hadn't been using the access because he was maintaining the illusion of a secluded, exclusive entrance somewhere else, likely bringing his personal car in through the small side gate and making multiple, tedious turns. But the moment his HVAC system needed replacing, or God forbid, a medical emergency required an ambulance, he needed the backyard plot. His entire eviction scheme, the aggressive legal threats, the concrete wall, it was all a desperate attempt to seize this legally ambiguous strip of land before anyone realized its true importance. If he didn't own that plot, he effectively didn't own a fully functional, legally compliant mansion. The city could, potentially, fine him, restrict occupancy, or even mandate the costly, landscape-destroying front driveway rebuild if that essential access point was blocked. I printed every single one of those 3 documents, highlighting the crucial lines and the mapped routes. I felt a cold, satisfying wave of calculated confidence wash over me. Marcus had played a game of petty territorial spite, thinking he was dealing with simple, defeated retirees. He had underestimated the meticulousness of an angry daughter. The backyard plot wasn't our weakness. It was Marcus's Achilles heel, his biggest and most expensive secret. The game had just changed. I couldn't wait to see his face. I didn't immediately reveal my discovery to my parents. I wanted the element of surprise on my side, and frankly, I didn't want to raise their hopes until I had executed the plan. I called Emily, my solicitor friend, and arranged an urgent, confidential meeting. I walked into her office, not with the defeated attitude of a litigant, but with the quiet confidence of someone holding a winning lottery ticket. I spread the 3 printed documents, the site plan, the zoning variance, and the emergency access certification, across her mahogany desk. "Emily," I said, pointing to the thick red line marked on the emergency access map, "forget the boundary dispute. Forget the compost bins. This is what Marcus is fighting for." Emily, a pragmatic and slightly cynical professional, leaned in, her brow furrowed as she scanned the technical jargon. I explained the connection: the restrictive front yard variance, the narrow utility access, and the undeniable fact that the only approved route for large vehicles, especially fire and safety vehicles, ran directly and exclusively through the backyard plot. "Wait a minute," she murmured, tracing the line of the old property boundary against the new construction. "If Parcel 42B, your backyard plot, is legally ambiguous and not technically owned by him, then Then he has a 3-story, multi-million-dollar mansion that is technically non-compliant with local fire safety codes, which mandates approved, unobstructed access for emergency vehicles, I finished for her. If that plot is blocked, or even just legally uncertain, he's got a massive problem. This isn't about petty neighbor squabbles. This is about protecting a 9-figure asset. The implication was staggering. If a fire broke out and the fire department couldn't legally or physically traverse that plot, Marcus's insurance, his mortgage, and his ability to even live in the house could be jeopardized. The city, which is notoriously strict about emergency access in high-value properties, could issue a stop-use order or massive fines until the access was secured, either by rebuilding the entire front drive or acquiring legal title to the plot. Emily sat back, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. This changes everything. He's not threatening to sue you for a few $100s worth of land. He's trying to silence a multi-million-dollar liability. You are not the defendant, Sarah. You are the gatekeeper. We quickly formulated a strategy. Instead of engaging in the typical, drawn-out property title battle, we would pivot to the regulatory issue. We wouldn't tell Marcus we knew about the emergency access. We would simply file a formal notice of our intent to legally fence off our current property, utilizing the ambiguous nature of the backyard plot to our advantage. Since the plot was unowned, we couldn't fence it off, but we could certainly fence off our legally owned property line, which abutted the plot. And we'd make sure the fence was formidable, perhaps a lovely high wrought iron barrier, complete with a lock and an imposing private property, no trespassing sign, positioned right where the fire access route began. This move wasn't hostile on the surface. It was merely a defensive measure against Marcus's threat of a concrete wall. But the implicit message would be terrifyingly clear to him. Your access is now conditional. Emily drafted the letter, a masterpiece of legal formality and veiled threat. It simply stated that, in light of the recent ambiguities and his aggressive legal actions, my parents had decided to secure their legally owned property line to protect their privacy and enjoyment of the estate. The notice informed him that any proposed construction, i.e., his concrete spite wall, on his side would be met with immediate legal injunctions, and that my parents would be installing a new barrier on their property line next Monday. We made sure to send it via registered mail, requiring a signature directly to Marcus, bypassing his legal team, a tactic intended to maximize his personal panic. The response was immediate and frantic. The next day, a black, intimidating sedan pulled up to my parents' humble driveway. Out stepped Marcus, not in his usual bespoke suit, but in slightly disheveled business casual, his face etched with thinly veiled anxiety. He hadn't called. He just showed up, violating his own policy of treating us like inconvenient ghosts. He strode up to my father, his attempt at professional poise crumbling quickly. "Look, Uncle David," he said, his voice strained with false amiability. "About that plot, there seems to have been a misunderstanding. The lawyers tend to get carried away." My father, who had been completely briefed on my discovery and our plan, was magnificent. He looked Marcus squarely in the eye, holding his ground. "A misunderstanding, Marcus? Your lawyers threatened to build a concrete wall that would ruin my garden. I call that malice, not a misunderstanding." Marcus tried to pivot to an offer. "I'm willing to buy the plot from you. Name your price. $5,000? $10,000? Just a clean, quick transaction." I stepped out onto the porch then, holding the registered letter we'd sent. I kept my expression neutral, but my eyes were sharp. "Marcus?" I interjected, my voice quiet but firm. $10,000 for what is, by city ordinance, the emergency access route for a multi-million-dollar property? I think we both know that's a little low." Marcus froze. The blood drained from his face, and for the first time in his life, he looked genuinely, thoroughly terrified. His facade had cracked wide open. He finally understood that I knew the truth. Marcus's reaction to my simple statement, mentioning emergency access route, was the vindication I'd been seeking. His usually composed, arrogant face dissolved into an expression of desperate calculation. He quickly glanced around, as if worried the neighbors, or worse, a city inspector, might be listening. The $10,000 offer was instantly forgotten. He forced a weak chuckle. Sarah, I'm not sure what you think you found, but you've clearly misunderstood some old blueprints. That's merely an old construction path, nothing official. Is that so? I countered, walking slowly towards him, making sure my parents were watching this masterclass in manipulative retreat. Because I have the signed and stamped emergency access certification from the City Planning Department, dated 2 years ago, specifying that Parcel 42B, your backyard plot, is the only approved access point for fire and emergency vehicles to reach your structure due to your zoning variance. A construction path doesn't get stamped by the fire marshal, Marcus. I didn't pull out the document. The fact that I knew its name and its context was enough to shatter his remaining composure. He knew I had him. The legal battle he was prepared for, a simple land dispute, was nothing compared to the regulatory nightmare I could unleash. He dropped the pretense of the kindly, misunderstanding cousin and moved straight into high-stakes negotiation mode, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. All right, Sarah. You're smart, very smart. Let's talk about this like professionals. This is a property issue, and I'm prepared to make a very generous offer to secure a permanent easement across that strip. An easement? I scoffed. You want to buy a perpetual right-of-way over the land you just tried to bully my elderly parents out of, threatening to build a concrete eyesore? And you think an easement, which still leaves my parents with legal headaches and potential liabilities, is enough? My father, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up, injecting a surprising level of moral authority into the conversation. We're not selling, Marcus. We're not leasing. We were happy for you to use it informally, as family, before your lawyers started sending threats. Now we're securing our property, exactly as our lawyer advised. He pointed towards where the backyard plot began. The wrought iron fence goes up Monday morning, with a lock. The word lock was the ultimate weapon. If we fenced off our property line and put a padlock on the gate that blocked the access path, Marcus's mansion would instantly become a non-compliant, massive liability. He wouldn't be able to sleep, knowing that if something went wrong, the fire department would have to smash down his marble fence, or worse, struggle to reach him at all. His insurance company, upon discovering this lack of mandated access, would likely cancel his high-value policy instantly. His bank might call the note on his mortgage. The true value of the backyard plot wasn't in its dirt. It was in the catastrophic liability it shielded. Marcus became desperate. No, wait. The fence. You can't. That would completely jeopardize the accessibility. Think about the property values of both our homes. He was trying to frame it as a mutual problem, but we all knew whose property was truly at risk. I am thinking about our property value, Marcus, I replied coolly. Your threatened concrete wall was designed to reduce our property value and quality of life. Now, we're simply taking measures to protect our space. I leaned in, giving him the chance to understand the true cost of his greed. You asked for a price. Fine. Let's talk about the true value of what you want. You want to buy the silence regarding your regulatory non-compliance, the guaranteed safety access for your multi-million-dollar asset, and the right to treat your family with contempt and then expect favors. Marcus flinched at the last part, but his focus was entirely on the money and the access now. What is your number, Sarah? Be reasonable. I will cut you a check right now. This was the pivotal moment. I knew the number had to be high enough to hurt him, not out of malice, but to establish the seriousness of the situation and prevent future abuse, but also framed in a way that benefited my parents directly, without the mess of outright land sale, which could lead to future legal complexities. I smiled, not a warm smile, but the cool, calculating smile of a businesswoman who just cornered her mark. We don't want to sell you the land, Marcus. We don't want your money directly for that piece of dirt. We want something that will actually benefit my parents and rectify the damage you've already caused. I was setting the stage for the ultimate non-monetary demand, a twist that would not only secure the access for him, but fundamentally change the dynamic between our two properties, and more importantly, between Marcus and his family. The look on his face told me he was ready to agree to almost anything to prevent me from making that single devastating phone call to the city zoning enforcement office. 5. Block 5. The price of redemption and access. Word count 996. The air thickened between us. Marcus was standing rigid, waiting for me to name my price, mentally calculating how many commas would be in the final figure. He expected a massive cash payout, a number that would make him resent us, but one he could ultimately absorb as a cost of doing business. He expected us to be as simple and transactional as his other dealings. But my goal was never just money. It was security, justice, and forcing him to acknowledge the true nature of family obligation. "We're not going to charge you an access fee, Marcus," I stated, watching his shoulders relax slightly before I delivered the true demand. "But we have 3 non-negotiable conditions for granting you a permanent, notarized, and legally binding access easement across Parcel 42B, the emergency access route." Marcus raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Conditions? Get to the point." "The first condition," I began, my tone turning steel cold, "is the immediate and complete retraction of all legal threats against my parents, specifically the formal abandonment of any claim to Parcel 42B. You will pay all outstanding legal fees incurred by my parents defending themselves against your initial predatory claims. And you will write a personal letter of apology to my mother and father for the distress you caused." He winced at the apology, but nodded curtly. "Done. Lawyers will handle the retraction and fees today. The letter, I'll draft something." "The second condition," I continued, pointing back towards my parents' aging house, "is the full, professional renovation of their home. New roof, updated HVAC, full plumbing overhaul, and external painting. All to be managed and paid for by you using licensed and reputable contractors. The work must start within 30 days and be overseen by an independent project manager selected by us." Marcus's eyes widened. This was a significant cost, easily pushing into the 6 figures, far more than the $10,000 he initially offered. "A full renovation? That's excessive, Sarah. It's an old house." "It is the house your grandparents built," I interrupted, cutting him off before his dismissiveness could take root. "And it's the price of the only working driveway to your minimalist art museum. Consider it a fair exchange for securing your entire asset base and preventing a regulatory catastrophe. If you feel it's excessive, we can certainly take this discussion to the city zoning board right now. I have their direct line saved." I tapped my phone to emphasize the point. He hesitated, running a hand over his expensive haircut. The thought of the public exposure, the fines, and the potential mandatory front drive demolition, which would require years of disruptive construction and tank his property value, was clearly worse than the renovation cost. "Fine," he finally ground out. "Renovation, independent manager, done." "The third and most important condition," I concluded, stepping right up to him so only he could hear the gravity in my voice, "is the establishment of a permanent restrictive covenant on your property deed. This covenant will stipulate that the section of your land adjacent to my parents' property, where you threatened to build that concrete wall, must forever remain an open, natural green space. No construction, no walls, no structures above 3 feet. Ever. This prevents any future malice or attempts to block their light or view." This last point was non-monetary, entirely about securing my parents' long-term peace of mind and quality of life. It was about taking away his power to inflict petty architectural spite. It forced him to build a beautiful, permanent buffer between the 2 homes, ensuring that the peaceful, modest side of the family got to keep their sunlight and their view. Marcus stared at me, then at the house, then at my father, who met his gaze with quiet dignity. He realized this wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. The alternative, losing the compliant access to his multi-million-dollar asset, was financially and reputationally devastating. After a long, tense silence, he conceded with a barely perceptible nod. 3 conditions. Understood. I will instruct my lawyers to draw up the access easement agreement incorporating these terms immediately. Not your lawyers, Marcus, I corrected, handing him Emily's card. Our lawyer, Emily Davis, will draft the final agreement. You will pay her firm's fees for the drafting, and you will pay for an independent, highly rated appraiser to certify the completed renovation value. We control the process now. You control the cost. He took the card, his face a mask of bitter defeat. He had tried to crush his family with petty legal threats, and had instead been forced to finance their home improvements and legally bind his own ability to ever harm them again. The meeting ended abruptly. Marcus got back into his black sedan and sped away, the tires kicking up a small plume of dust. My father put his arm around my mother, who was beaming. "You did it, sweetie," she whispered. "You saved our home." But the story wasn't quite over. The agreements had to be finalized, and Marcus's sincerity, even under duress, was always questionable. The final twist was still waiting in the wings. 6. Block 6. The permanent solution and the irony of access. Word count 981. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal action, all dictated by Emily and meticulously paid for by Marcus. The formal withdrawal of his land claim and the written apology arrived within 48 hours. The apology was sterile and clearly lawyer-proofed, but my parents appreciated the admission of wrong, however forced. It was the first time Marcus had ever admitted defeat to them. The real evidence of Marcus's surrender, however, wasn't on paper. It was the parade of construction vehicles and the sight of my father watching, coffee in hand, as Marcus's crew began replacing the rotting roof of the family home. The irony was palpable. The man who tried to landlock his own mansion to save money on his driveway was now spending a fortune to upgrade the very house he tried to minimize. The final legal instrument was signed 3 weeks later, the Permanent Access and Maintenance Easement Agreement. This document formally acknowledged Parcel 42B as a critical, shared access route, specifically naming it the Emergency Services and Vehicular Access Easement for the Marble Mausoleum, and granted Marcus perpetual right-of-way. Crucially, in exchange, he agreed to all 3 of my conditions. The renovation of my parents' home was completed 3 months later. It was spectacular. New, energy-efficient HVAC, flawless plumbing, a beautiful, structurally sound roof, and a fresh coat of paint that made the old house look brand new. The value of their home skyrocketed, and more importantly, their quality of life was restored and enhanced. But the most satisfying victory was the restrictive covenant. This was filed against the deed of the Marble Mausoleum and permanently mandated that the area adjacent to my parents' backyard, the land Marcus was going to use for his concrete spite wall, be maintained as a manicured, open green space. It was a beautiful, lush barrier, ensuring my parents always had sunlight and privacy. Marcus essentially paid to create a permanent, beautiful park for my parents to look at, all to save his own mansion's functional access. The dynamic between the properties fundamentally changed. Marcus had the secure, legally compliant driveway he needed, but he had paid for it not with cash to bury the problem, but with permanent, structural concessions that benefited his family. And here is the final, delicious twist of irony. Since the access easement had been formally recorded, and since Marcus had paid to create such a clear, open path, which, by the way, was now beautifully paved and maintained by him as per the agreement, it became the obvious and easiest route for all his large, non-emergency vehicles as well. We began noticing things. First, the delivery trucks for his expensive furniture and wines would use the easement. Then, the giant landscaping equipment. Finally, on the rare occasions Marcus hosted one of his high society parties, the valet service started directing the largest, fanciest sedans and limousines to enter through the newly paved access easement, which terminated at his hidden side entrance. The backyard plot, the forgotten strip of land he tried to claim for $10,000, was no longer the back entrance. It was the only functional grand entrance. The guests, driving past my parents' newly renovated, charming old house, would follow the paved access route straight to the heart of his estate. One afternoon, I was visiting my parents, drinking lemonade on their newly screened-in porch, watching Marcus's $300,000 sports car casually drive across the easement. My father smiled, a slow, deep smile of quiet triumph. "You know, Sarah," he mused, "Marcus thought he was building a fortress of exclusivity. He spent all that money on marble and security, and in the end, the only practical way into his mansion is across the land he called insignificant and tried to steal from his own family." He paused, taking a sip of his lemonade. He wanted to evict us from the plot, but all he did was secure the access. And now, every single time he drives home, he has to acknowledge that his entire empire relies on the goodwill, and the legal savvy of the people he tried to bully. Every delivery, every visitor, every emergency service, they all have to pass through the family plot. It was the perfect, permanent reminder. Marcus got his access, but at the cost of his control and his ego. My parents got security, peace of mind, and a beautifully restored home. The backyard plot remained, a monument not to greed, but to the fact that sometimes the smallest piece of land holds the key to the biggest secrets and the most satisfying redemption. We didn't just win the plot, we leveraged it to win the war, secure my parents' future, and teach a greedy cousin the true value of family boundaries.